blood on the white marble of the royal promenade. That was the very first thing Sovereign Isolde saw when the blast doors of her dropship hissed open. The capital city of Ethelgard wasn't just under attack, it was a graveyard. The orbital defense grid had been sabotaged from the inside, and the impenetrable citadel, her home, was burning. But it wasn't the fall of her empire that made her twin heart stop in her chest. It was the silence coming from the royal nursery. Her children were in the east wing, the same wing where the smoke was thickest. Isolde drew her ceremonial blade, her mind screaming a single terrifying thought. I am too late. The royal transport gilded crest tore through Corvus Prime's atmosphere at a velocity that threatened to shear its ablative armor clean off. Sovereign Isolde stood on the command deck, her knuckles white as she gripped the tactical console. She was the ruler of the Kalen Reach, a species known across the galactic arm for their imposing stature, telepathic resonance, and unbroken lineage of warrior queens. Yet in this moment, she was nothing more than a terrified mother. Atmospheric entry at critical heat. "Your Majesty," shouted Pilot Bennett, his hands flying across the navigation yokes. "We are losing the port thruster. Reroute auxiliary power and maintain trajectory." Isolde commanded her voice dangerously calm, though her telepathic aura was a chaotic storm of dread. "I do not care if this ship shatters the moment we touch the landing pad. Get me to the Citadel." Beside her, Lieutenant Grayson, a human exchange officer acting as her comms chief, was frantically twisting dials on his headset. "Still nothing, Sovereign. The Citadel's local network is completely jammed. It's not just a blackout, it's a localized electromagnetic dead zone. Someone deliberately severed the east wing from the rest of the planet." Isolde's golden eyes narrowed. The east wing. The royal nurseries. She had only been gone for 3 solar days, attending a summit in the neighboring sector. She had left her twins, Prince Lysander and Princess Aurelia, in the care of her most trusted Praetorian guards and a small staff of caretakers. Ethelgard was supposed to be the safest fortress in a dozen star systems. Its shields could withstand a direct hit from a dreadnought. But shields meant nothing if the enemy was already inside. The gilded crest slammed onto the private landing tier of the palace, the landing struts shrieking in protest as they buckled under the immense force of the emergency deceleration. Before the ramp had even fully deployed, Isolde vaulted over the railing, her heavy royal cloak discarded on the deck. The air outside was thick with the acrid stench of ionized ozone burning tapestries and the undeniable copper scent of Kalen blood. The grand promenade, usually bustling with diplomats and servants, was a slaughterhouse. Elite Praetorian guards wearing the silver armor of the royal house lay dead. Isolde knelt beside the nearest fallen guard. It was Captain Kalen, a veteran of 100 campaigns. His armor hadn't been breached by blaster fire. Instead, his eyes were wide blood vessels ruptured, and his neural stalks, the sensitive appendages that allowed Kalen to communicate telepathically, were blackened and withered. "A neural scourge," Isolde whispered, a cold terror gripping her spine. "What is it, Majesty?" Grayson asked, sprinting down the ramp behind her with his sidearm drawn. "It's an illegal sonic telepathic weapon," Isolde explained, her voice trembling. "It emits a frequency that weaponizes our own telepathic network. It causes immediate catastrophic brain hemorrhaging in our species. They didn't fight their way in Grayson. They walked in, triggered the scourge, and slaughtered my guards while they were paralyzed by their own minds." "Then who—" Grayson started looking toward the heavy Durasteel blast doors that led to the inner sanctum. "Treason!" Isolde snarled. "Only High Command has access to the internal defense grid. Someone lowered the dampeners." She didn't wait for her remaining escort. Driven by a primal maternal fury, Isolde sprinted through the devastated corridors. She passed beautiful vaulted halls now scarred by plasma fire. She passed more bodies, nannies, tutors, minor nobles, all bearing the horrific hallmarks of the neural scourge. With every step, her hope fractured. The assassins had moved with terrifying efficiency, sweeping directly toward the nursery. Whoever orchestrated this wanted to end her bloodline entirely. They wanted her to return to a dead world and an empty throne. She reached the grand foyer of the East Wing. The massive gold-inlaid doors of the royal nursery had been blown off their hinges by a shaped breaching charge. Smoke poured from the dark gap like a dying breath. Isolde stopped. Her breath hitched. The silence emanating from the dark room was absolute. There was no crying. No telepathic hum of her children's brilliant minds, just the agonizing heavy quiet of a tomb. She gripped her blade tears, finally breaking through her stoic facade, and stepped into the smoke-filled nursery. 2 hours earlier, Thomas Wright dragged his mop bucket down the immaculate sunlit corridor of the East Wing. He was a human, 58 years old, with salt and pepper hair, a permanent limp in his left knee, and hands that were scarred and calloused. In the grand hierarchy of the Kalen Reach, humans were a curiosity, a structurally fragile, non-telepathic, short-lived species, mostly employed in maintenance logistics and heavy labor. Thomas liked it that way. He liked being invisible. He liked the quiet rhythm of polishing the marble floors, the gentle hum of the Citadel's climate control, and the distant melodic laughter of the royal twins. He was currently wiping down a crystalline vase near the nursery doors when he saw Commander Sterling marching down the hall. Sterling was a high-ranking Kalen military official, usually adorned in gleaming ceremonial armor. Today, however, he wore unmarked tactical gear. Behind him marched 12 figures, clad in heavy black void suits, carrying military-grade plasma carbines. Thomas kept his head down, scrubbing a spot on the floor, but his eyes tracked their movement in the reflection of the marble. Something was wrong. The guards' footsteps were synchronized heavy, combat spacing, and they were bypassing the standard security checkpoints. Suddenly, Sterling stopped at the entrance of the East Wing. He reached into his tactical pouch and pulled out a small, metallic cylinder. He twisted the top, and a faint, almost imperceptible blue light pulsed from the device. Inside the nursery, the head nanny, a massive Kalen female named Vala, suddenly shrieked. It wasn't a sound of physical pain, but a psychic scream that echoed into the physical world. She dropped to her knees, clutching her head, her golden eyes rolling back. In the corridor, 2 other Kalen guards convulsed, dropping their weapons and collapsing to the floor, blood seeping from their ears and noses. Thomas felt nothing. To a human, a neural scourge was just a silent, inert piece of metal. Humans had no telepathic receptors. To Thomas, it just looked like a magic trick that was killing everyone around him. Sterling stepped over the convulsing bodies, unholstering his plasma pistol. "Sweep the rooms!" the commander ordered his assassins in a cold, guttural tone. "Leave none of the royal bloodline alive. The new regime begins today." Thomas froze behind a decorative pillar. His heart hammered against his ribs. The twins. They were in the playroom just beyond the shattered doors. Thomas had spent the last 10 years trying to forget who he was. He had buried his past in a shallow grave on a backwater human colony. He had traded his Terran orbital dropshock trooper armor for a janitor's jumpsuit. He had promised himself he would never again touch a weapon after the massacre at Helios Ridge. But as he heard the heavy boots of the assassins marching toward the room where 4-year-old Lysander and Aurelia were hiding something inside, the old human snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was the awakening of a buried, terrifying instinct. The Kalen thought humans were weak because they couldn't read minds. They didn't understand that humanity's greatest weapon was an adrenaline-fueled, hyper-violent survival instinct forged in the brutal gravity of Earth. Thomas quietly snapped the wooden handle of his mop over his knee. He didn't have armor. He didn't have a gun. He had a jagged piece of wood, a bucket of caustic cleaning solvent, and 30 years of specialized close-quarters combat experience. The last assassin in the formation paused near Thomas's pillar to check his rifle battery. Thomas stepped out of the shadows. He didn't make a sound. With ruthless, terrifying precision, he drove the splintered end of the mop handle upward, bypassing the assassin's heavy chest plate and sliding it through the soft, unarmored joint under the jaw straight into the brain pan. The alien gurgled its eyes going wide. Before the body could even hit the floor, Thomas caught the falling plasma carbine, stripped the dead man's combat knife from its sheath, and dragged the corpse into the shadows. He checked the weapon. Full charge. All right, Tommy. He thought, his breathing slowing down, his arthritis seemingly evaporating under a massive dump of adrenaline. Time to go to work. Inside the nursery, Sterling was pointing his weapon at the heavy reinforced doors of the playroom. The children had managed to trigger the emergency lockdown, but the durasteel was already melting under the heat of a breaching torch. "Hurry it up," Sterling barked. "The Sovereign ship will break orbit in an hour. I want their heads on pikes before she lands." Suddenly, the lights in the East Wing died. The assassins activated their low-light visors, sweeping their weapons into the darkness. "Who cut the power?" Sterling demanded. A high-pitched hissing sound filled the air. From the ventilation shafts above, a fine, highly corrosive mist began to spray down upon them. It was Thomas's heavy-duty floor solvent, pumped directly into the local air scrubbers. It wouldn't melt through their armor, but as it settled on their visors, it immediately began to eat away at the optical sensors blinding them. "Contact! We are blinded!" one of the assassins yelled, clawing at his ruined visor. From the darkness, a plasma bolt tore through the room, striking the blinded assassin squarely in the chest. The superheated energy punched through his armor, dropping him instantly. "Return fire! Return fire!" Sterling screamed, firing blindly into the shadows. Plasma splashed against the walls, igniting the beautiful drapery and melting the priceless Kalen artwork. But the shooter was already gone. Thomas moved like a ghost. He remembered the layout of the room perfectly. He knew the blind spots. He knew where the floorboards didn't creak. He flanked the squad, coming up behind a pair of assassins who were firing toward the doorway. He didn't waste plasma. He stepped in close, grabbed the nearest assassin by the back of the helmet, and drove his stolen combat knife through the base of the neck, severing the spinal cord. He used the dying alien as a meat shield as the second assassin turned, absorbing 3 plasma bolts before Thomas raised his carbine and blew the attacker's head off. Sterling watched in horror as his elite kill squad was systematically dismantled by an unseen phantom. "Use the thermal scanners, find them." Sir, one of the remaining mercenaries, shouted, his voice laced with panic. "The thermal signature. It's too small. It's too cold. It's not a Kalen." Thomas, hiding behind a massive overturned mahogany desk, checked his rifle battery. 10 shots left. 6 hostiles remaining, including Sterling. His breathing was heavy, and a stray plasma burn had grazed his left shoulder, searing the flesh down to the muscle. He ignored the pain. He looked over his shoulder at the melted playroom door. He could hear the twins crying inside. "Nobody touches the kids," Thomas whispered, his eyes hardening into chips of ice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a chemical light stick. He cracked it, threw it across the room to draw their fire, and charged in the opposite direction. Queen Isolde stepped through the blasted doorway of the nursery, the smoke stinging her eyes. She held her ceremonial sword in a white-knuckle grip, prepared to die, avenging her children. But as the smoke began to clear, the scene before her defied all logic. The vast, opulent nursery was completely destroyed. The walls were scorched black by plasma fire. The massive crystal chandelier had fallen shattering into 1,000,000 pieces across the floor. And then there were the bodies. Isolde counted them. 1, 2, 5. 10 heavily armored Kaelan mercenaries, elite killers. They lay in grotesque positions, their armor pierced by precise plasma fire, or worse, their bodies broken by brutal, intimate melee combat. One of the mercenaries was pinned to the wall by a shattered piece of a heavy oak table. Another had his helmet completely caved in by what looked like a solid brass fire extinguisher. This wasn't the work of a security team. This was a slaughter. This was the work of an apex predator. "Lysander!" Isolde called out, her voice cracking. "Aurelia! Mama!" The sound came from behind a hastily constructed barricade in the corner of the room. Heavy metal cabinets, a reinforced desk, and blast-proof glass from the windows had been piled up to create a small bunker. Isolde ran toward it, throwing a heavy cabinet aside with her immense Kaelan strength. Huddled in the corner, covered in soot but completely unharmed, were her twin children. They looked terrified, clinging to each other, but they were alive. Isolde dropped to her knees, pulling them into her chest, burying her face in their hair, sobbing openly. "You're safe. You're safe. By the ancestors, you're safe." "He protected us, Mama," Lysander whimpered, pointing a trembling finger toward the center of the room. The quiet man. Isolde looked up. Standing in the center of the devastation, leaning heavily against a marble pillar, was Thomas Wright. The human servant looked almost unrecognizable. His gray jumpsuit was drenched in Kaelan blue blood and his own red blood. His left arm hung limply at his side, severely burned by a plasma grazing. In his right hand, he held a Kaelan combat knife, its edge dulled and chipped from striking armor. At his feet lay the body of Commander Sterling. Sterling's armor was practically untouched by weapons fire. Instead, his neck was twisted at an impossible, grotesque angle. Isolde stood slowly, her children clinging to her legs. She stared at the frail 58-year-old human who cleaned her floors. The man who apologized when he bumped into a table. The man the Kaelan nobility treated as an invisible pet. "Thomas," Isolde whispered, utterly bewildered. You did this." Thomas spat a glob of blood onto the marble floor. He looked exhausted, his face pale, but his eyes were terrifying. The deferential, subservient gaze was gone. In its place was the cold, calculating stare of a veteran who had stared into the abyss and smiled. "They brought a telepathic jammer. Your Majesty," Thomas said, his voice raspy, devoid of any royal titles or formal inflection. "Knocked out your guards, melted their brains, but I ain't got the hardware for that kind of headache." He slowly limped over to Sterling's body, reached down, and ripped the neural scourge device from the dead commander's belt tossing it to Isolde. 12 of them, Isolde said, looking around the room. These are Vornak Syndicate mercenaries. Sterling hired the best. And you killed them all, with a mop and a knife. Thomas let out a dry, humorless chuckle. I had a plasma carbine for a bit, but the battery died. Had to improvise. Humans are good at that. Isolde stepped closer, her telepathic senses finally recovering from the shock. She reached out with her mind, expecting to feel the void that humans usually presented. Instead, she felt a tidal wave of suppressed trauma, tactical genius, and a terrifying icy rage that made her physically step back. "Who are you, Thomas?" she demanded, her voice echoing with the authority of the sovereign. "What are you?" Thomas sighed, letting the heavy combat knife slip from his fingers. It clattered loudly against the floor. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. 30 years ago, before I came to this sector, I was a gunnery sergeant in the Terran Orbital Drop Shock Infantry, Thomas said, quietly looking at the ceiling. We were the guys the United Earth government sent in when diplomacy failed and orbital bombardment wasn't an option. We dropped from orbit in tin cans straight into the meat grinder. He looked at the Kalen children, his hard eyes softening just a fraction. I did things, Your Majesty, things that keep me awake every single night. I retired. I ran as far away from humanity as I could get. I just wanted to sweep floors. I just wanted it to be quiet. He looked at Sterling's corpse with disgust. But these bastards tried to hurt the kids, and I found out I'm not quite done being a monster yet. Isolde stood in stunned silence. The galaxy viewed humanity as builders, traders, sometimes clumsy laborers. They were considered soft because they didn't have hardened exoskeletons, they didn't have telepathy, and they didn't possess the sheer physical mass of the Kalen. But looking at the slaughter in her nursery, Isolde realized the terrifying truth. Humans didn't need natural weapons. They were the weapon. Before Isolde could speak, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the corridor. Lieutenant Grayson and a squad of heavily armed Kalen loyalists burst into the room, sweeping their weapons. They froze, taking in the carnage. Grayson lowered his rifle, his jaw dropping, as he saw the dead assassins and the battered human sitting on the floor. Sovereign, what happened here? Grayson breathed. Isolde looked at Thomas. The old soldier was struggling to keep his eyes open, the blood loss finally taking its toll. Get the royal medics here immediately, Isolde commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. If this man dies, I will execute every physician in the Citadel. Yes, Majesty, Grayson barked, calling into his comms. Isolde knelt in the blood and shattered glass next to Thomas. She didn't care that her royal robes were being stained. She placed her large, elegant hand over his, applying pressure to his bleeding shoulder. You are no monster, Thomas Wright, she said softly, ensuring he heard her before he passed out. You are the shield of the Kalen Reach, and from this day forward, no human will ever be looked down upon in my empire again. Thomas managed a weak, blood-stained smile. Just make sure I get a raise, Your Majesty. Mops ain't cheap. His eyes rolled back, and he slumped against the wall. Thomas awoke to the sterile, ozone-scented air of a high-tier Kalen trauma ward. He was floating, literally. The medical bed was a grav plate, suspending him in a field of warm bioluminescent gel that was aggressively knitting his torn muscles and seared skin back together. For a terrifying second, his mind threw him 30 years into the past. He wasn't in a palace. He was in a medevac shuttle over the burning dust of Helios Ridge, listening to the screams of his squad mates as plasma fire chewed through their hull. He gasped, thrashing in the suspension gel. "Easy, Sergeant Wright. You are secure." Thomas blinked the stasis fluid from his eyes. Standing at the edge of the grav bed was Queen Isolde. She had discarded her blood-stained ceremonial robes for a dark, armored tunic woven from carbon silk. Flanking her were two hulking Kalen loyalists, though they kept a respectful and noticeably cautious distance from the human. Sitting in a chair to her left was Lieutenant Grayson, the human exchange officer. Grayson looked like a kid who had just discovered his favorite grandfather was secretly an apex predator. "The gel will deactivate in a moment," Isolde said, waving an elegant hand over a console. The suspension field dropped, and Thomas settled onto the firm mattress beneath. He groaned, testing his left shoulder. The agonizing plasma burn was gone, replaced by a patch of smooth, pinkish skin. Alien medicine was a hell of a thing. "How long was I out?" Thomas asked, his voice still rough. He didn't bother with the royal titles. The moment for pretending to be a subservient janitor had died in the nursery. 18 hours, Isolde replied, her golden eyes studying him intently. The royal physicians were astounded. They said a Kalen would have died from the shock of your injuries alone. Your biology is aggressively resilient. Your cellular regeneration practically fought the medicine to heal you on its own terms. "We're stubborn like that," Thomas grunted, sitting up and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. He looked at Grayson. "The kids, Prince Lysander and Princess Aurelia, are safe, Sergeant," Grayson answered quickly, sitting up straight. "They are in a secure bunker beneath the citadel. No one gets in or out without the Sovereign's biometric seal." Thomas let out a long breath, staring at his calloused hands. "Good." Isolde stepped forward, dismissing her guards with a flick of her wrist. The heavy doors sealed shut, leaving the three of them alone. "We extracted Commander Sterling's memory core before his neural pathways degraded." Isolde began her telepathic aura, dark and turbulent, with suppressed fury. He was not acting alone. The neural scourge he used was military-grade, heavily restricted. And the mercenaries he hired, the Vornak Syndicate, were paid through a proxy account linked to the Ethelgard High Council. Thomas looked up. "A coup. A slaughter," Isolde corrected coldly. "I was intended to return to a dead family, a broken spirit, and an empire begging for stability. Lord Regent Alistair, my second-in-command, has been championing a treaty with the Kryn Ascendancy. I refused it. It seems he decided my bloodline was an obstacle to his political ambitions." "So what's the play?" Thomas asked. "You arrest him. You're the queen." "I cannot," Isolde admitted, a flicker of vulnerability crossing her stoic face. "The Praetorian Guard is compromised. Sterling commanded 3 battalions. I do not know who is loyal to the crown and who is loyal to Alistair's coin. If I move against the Lord Regent openly, it sparks a civil war that will burn this planet to ash. And worse, the Vornak Syndicate." Grayson pulled up a holographic projection from his datapad. A massive, jagged warship rotated in the blue light. The assassins in the nursery were just the vanguard. Deep space telemetry just picked up a Vornak Syndicate dreadnought holding position at the edge of the system. It's operating under stealth protocols, but our orbital buoys caught its thermal wake. If Alistair realizes the hit failed, he'll give them the signal to breach orbit. Thomas stared at the hologram. He recognized the brutal utilitarian design of the ship. He had seen ships like that before. "You're in a box, Your Majesty," Thomas said quietly. Your military is poisoned. Your enemies are at the gates, and your kids are in the crosshairs. Which brings me to you, Thomas, Isolde said, stepping into his personal space. Her imposing height meant she looked down at him, but there was no superiority in her gaze, only desperate calculation. I researched your personnel file, the real one, not the forged civilian records you presented to my labor ministry. She tapped a console and a new file opened. Thomas Wright, serial number 884, Bravo Niner, Terran United Space Command, 1st Battalion Orbital Dropshock Infantry. You didn't just fight at Helios Ridge. You led a 3-man infiltration team into a Kryn, heavily fortified staging ground and disabled an entire planetary defense cannon using only kinetic explosives and close-quarters combat. Grayson stared at Thomas, his jaw slack. You were part of the Hell Jumpers. You were special forces. I was a lot of things, Thomas said, his eyes darkening. He looked away from the hologram. I worked for the government. Then I worked for the private sector, Spearhead Vanguard, Lockheed Martin's off-world wet work division. I spent 20 years doing the things diplomats pretend don't happen so humanity could secure a foothold in this galaxy. I retired because I was tired of washing blood out of my uniform. I am sorry to ask this of you, Thomas, Isolde said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. I am sorry to pull you back into the dark, but my people are telepaths. We feel the emotions of those we fight. We hesitate. We empathize. It is our greatest strength as a society, but right now it is a fatal weakness. She placed her hand over her twin hearts. I need someone who does not hesitate. I need someone who does not feel the psychic screams of the enemy. I need the ghost of Helios Ridge. Thomas looked at the Queen. He saw a mother backed into a corner. He remembered the terrified faces of the twins hiding behind that barricade. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, the tired old janitor was gone. Lieutenant Grayson, Thomas barked, his voice suddenly carrying the sharp, undeniable authority of a gunnery sergeant. Sir Grayson snapped to attention by pure instinct. Contact the Terran embassy. Tell them we need access to the diplomatic black site vault. I know for a fact General Dynamics ships their ambassadors with a break glass in case of war crate. Thomas stood up, rolling his newly healed shoulder. He looked at Queen Isolde. You want a monster, Your Majesty, fine. But we do this my way. No stun batons. No honorable duels. We're going to teach the Ethelgard High Council why humanity was quarantined for our first century in space. The war room of the Citadel was a masterpiece of Kalan architecture, vaulted ceilings inscribed with the names of 1,000 victorious generals. Right now, it felt like a tomb. Lord Regent Alistair stood at the head of the holographic tactical table, flanked by 3 heavily armored Praetorian commanders. Alistair was an older Kalan, his silver neural stalks indicating advanced age and immense telepathic power. He wore robes of midnight blue, and his face was set in a mask of calculated grief. The sovereign is sequestered in the medical wing, Alistair announced to the assembly of terrified ministers. The tragedy in the East Wing has shattered her mind. She speaks of phantoms and shadows. Until she recovers, I am invoking the Regency Protocol. The military falls under my command. Murmurs of assent and fear rippled through the room. First order of business. Alistair continued, his golden eyes narrowing. Lower the planetary defense grid. We need to allow the Vornak Syndicate medical and relief ships to enter orbit to aid in our... The heavy durasteel doors of the war room didn't just open. They were violently blown inward by a directed-shaped charge. The massive doors slammed into the marble floor with a deafening crash, kicking up a cloud of pulverized stone. The Praetorian commanders instantly drew their plasma sabers, the hum of superheated energy filling the room. Through the dust, two figures walked in. Queen Isolde strode forward, radiating a telepathic aura so intensely furious that several minor ministers collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads. She wore her full combat armor, the silver plating gleaming her ceremonial longsword resting on her hip. But it was the figure beside her that made the Praetorian guards freeze. Thomas Wright was unrecognizable. He was no longer wearing a gray jumpsuit. He was clad in United Space Command heavy assault armor. The plating was matte black, designed to absorb light and radar. His helmet was tucked under his arm, revealing a grim, scarred face. Over his right shoulder hung a massive, ugly piece of machinery, a General Dynamics M76 heavy magnetic accelerator rifle, a railgun. Regency protocol denied Alistair. Isolde's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the hall. Alistair recovered his composure quickly, though his eyes darted nervously to the heavily armed human. "Sovereign, you are unwell. The trauma of losing your children." "My children are alive," Isolde said the words, striking the room like a physical blow. Alistair's mask slipped. Just for a microsecond, his eyes widened and his telepathic aura spiked with genuine panic. It was all the confirmation Isolde needed. "They were saved," Isolde continued, her voice dripping with venom. "By my new first sword." She gestured to Thomas. One of the Praetorian commanders, a hulking Kaelin named Vane, scoffed loudly. "A human! You replace the elite Praetorian Guard with a fragile primate sovereign. This is madness. He is a laborer." "He killed 12 of your Vornak assassins with a mop handle and a kitchen knife," Isolde stated flatly. The room fell dead silent. Vane looked at Thomas, assessing the black armor and the crude, blocky weapon he carried. "Lies," Vane snarled. "No human has the reflexes to defeat a Kaelin warrior. I challenge this janitor for the right to stand beside the queen." Thomas didn't say a word. He didn't adopt a martial arts stance. He simply dropped his helmet to the floor. Vane ignited his plasma saber and lunged, moving with terrifying speed. To the alien eye, he was a blur of silver armor and burning blue energy. To Thomas, who had spent decades fighting hyperkinetic insectoid races in zero gravity, Vane telegraphed his strike a mile away. As Vane swung the saber down to cleave Thomas in two, the human simply stepped slightly to the left. The plasma blade hissed past his ear, searing the air. Before Vane could correct his momentum, Thomas brought the heavy steel stock of the M76 railgun up in a brutal, bone-shattering arc. Crack. The reinforced steel smashed directly into the soft, unarmored cluster of neural stalks at the back of Vane's neck. Vane didn't even scream. The sheer trauma to his nervous system instantly shut off his brain. The 9-foot-tall Kaelin warrior collapsed in a heap of useless armor, his plasma saber skittering across the floor. The fight had lasted exactly 2 seconds. The other two Praetorians stepped back, their weapons trembling. Thomas racked the charging handle of the railgun. The magnetic coils whined as they spooled up a terrifying high-pitched shriek that promised absolute destruction. He leveled the barrel at Lord Regent Alistair. "Now," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly growl that cut through the silence. "Who else has a problem with my resume?" Alistair raised his hands, his face pale. "This is an outrage. An alien holding a weapon to the Lord Regent Guards. Kill him." None of the guards moved. They were looking at Vane's unconscious body, and then back to the human who was currently aiming a weapon capable of punching a hole through a tank directly at their boss. "Lord Alistair," Isolde said, stepping forward, "you are stripped of your titles. You are stripped of your telepathic rights. You will be confined to the deep cells for high treason." "You are too late, Isolde," Alistair spat, dropping the facade. He tapped a hidden sequence on his wrist gauntlet. "The Vornak dreadnought in orbit was waiting for my signal. I just gave it. They are dropping drop pods into the city as we speak. They have orders to level the citadel." The citadel abruptly, violently shook. The sound of distant atmospheric sonic booms echoed through the thick walls. The invasion had begun. Alistair smiled a bloody, desperate smile. "Your guards are dead or loyal to me. You have one human. You cannot stop an army." Thomas looked at the holographic tactical table. Red blips were multiplying rapidly across the map of the capital city. They were landing right outside the palace gates. He didn't panic. He reached up and tapped his earpiece, connecting to Lieutenant Grayson back in the secure comms room. "Grayson, the package ready?" Thomas asked. "Ready," Sergeant Grayson's voice crackled back tight with adrenaline. "I managed to override the Citadel's automated defense turrets. They're offline. But, sir, are you sure about this?" "Do it, son," Thomas ordered. Thomas turned to Queen Isolde. "Your Majesty, I suggest you get your ministers behind the blast doors." "What did you do, Thomas?" Isolde asked, watching the human calmly strap his helmet onto his head. The visor polarized, turning into a featureless black void. "The Vornak use energy shields, right?" Thomas's voice was now mechanically altered by the helmet sounding cold and metallic. "Energy shields are great against plasma and lasers. They dissipate heat, but Earth never adopted plasma weapons. We stuck with kinetics. We use heavy solid slugs traveling at Mach 7. He checked the power gauge on his railgun. "Energy shields don't stop a 50 caliber tungsten round. They try to absorb it, and the kinetic feedback overloads the generator and cooks the guy inside his own armor." Outside the war room, the massive front gates of the Citadel exploded inward. Hundreds of heavily armed Vornak mercenaries began pouring into the courtyard, expecting no resistance from the deactivated automated turrets. "I had Grayson reroute the power from your turrets," Thomas said, walking toward the shattered doors of the war room, heading straight toward the invading army alone. "I told the United Space Command Embassy that an allied head of state was under attack. They gave me access to the orbital strike platform." He paused, looking back at the terrified Lord Regent. "We don't fight fair, Alistair. Welcome to the meat grinder." The grand courtyard of the Ethelgard Citadel, a masterpiece of ancient stonework and manicured bioluminescent gardens, had become a staging ground for an execution. 3 heavily armored Vornak Syndicate dropships had touched down, crushing the delicate flora beneath their massive landing struts. Hundreds of mercenaries poured out their energy shields, shimmering with a faint, iridescent purple hue. They were a brutal, pragmatic force, armed with heavy plasma repeaters and thermal lances designed to melt through blast doors. They expected the Citadel's automated turrets to be active. When they realized the defenses were offline, a cheer of guttural victory echoed across the courtyard. Their commander, a scarred veteran mercenary named Garrett, stepped down from the lead ship. "Form up, sweep the lower levels. I want the Queen alive so the Lord Regent can execute her on the public broadcast. Kill everyone else." Then the shattered main doors of the Citadel groaned. A single figure stepped out of the swirling smoke and dust. He didn't look like a Kalen Praetorian. He wasn't 9 feet tall, and he didn't carry an elegant glowing blade. He was a stocky bipedal creature, clad in matte black armor, carrying a brutally ugly blocky weapon. Garrett narrowed his eyes, adjusting his optical zoom. A human. What is this joke? He raised his voice, amplifying it through his suit's external speakers. Drop the weapon, primate, and you might live long enough to clean our boots. Thomas Wright didn't answer. He didn't monologue. He simply raised the General Dynamics M76 railgun, planted his boots firmly on the marble steps, and pulled the trigger. The sound was not a civilized hum or a fiery pew. It was a deafening, thunderous crack that broke the sound barrier, instantly accompanied by a blinding flash of displaced air. A .50 caliber depleted uranium slug left the barrel at Mach 7. It crossed the courtyard in a fraction of a millisecond. It struck Garrett's second-in-command squarely in the chest. The Vornak's advanced energy shield flared a brilliant, blinding white as it attempted to absorb the massive kinetic transfer. But shields were built to dissipate thermal energy and laser cohesion. They were not built to stop the sheer brute force momentum of solid metal moving at hypersonic speeds. The shield generator on the mercenary's back violently overloaded, detonating like a localized bomb. The kinetic round punched through the failing shield, through the heavy armor plating, and out the mercenary's back, tearing a hole the size of a dinner plate. The unfortunate alien was thrown backward with such force that he shattered the stone fountain behind him. The courtyard plunged into stunned silence. The Vornak mercenaries stared at their dead lieutenant, trying to process what had just happened. Thomas racked the charging handle, the magnetic coils screaming as they spooled up the next round. 1, he counted quietly over his private comms channel. "Open fire!" Garrett screamed, terror finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Burn him to ash!" A storm of green plasma erupted from the Vornak lines crisscrossing the courtyard. Thomas dove behind a massive collapsed stone pillar. The stone hissed and popped as superheated plasma bit into it, turning the ancient rock into molten slag. The heat inside his armor spiked the internal cooling fans, roaring to life. He leaned out from cover, the M76 tracking targets with ruthless efficiency. Crack. Another mercenary folded in half his shield, bursting into a shower of sparks. Crack. A heavy weapons specialist on a transport ramp was thrown violently into the bulkhead dead before he hit the ground. "Flank him," Garrett ordered, pointing toward the left garden. "He's only one man overwhelm his position." A squad of 20 mercenaries broke off, utilizing their jump jets to bound across the courtyard, seeking to get an angle behind Thomas's pillar. Inside the Citadel's comms room, Lieutenant Grayson's voice crackled frantically in Thomas's ear. "Sergeant, you have 20 hostiles pushing your left flank. They're moving too fast. Your weapon's fire rate can't keep up." "I know, kid." Thomas grunted, dropping an empty magazine and slapping a fresh block of tungsten slugs into the railgun. "Is the package in position?" "Targeting data confirmed. The United Space Command orbital platform Zeus is holding geostationary orbit directly above your coordinates. But sir, the blast radius..." "I'm in shielded cover," Thomas said, his voice ice cold. "Execute the DARPA protocol. Drop the rods." In the cold vacuum of space, 300 miles above Corvus Prime, a heavily classified unlisted satellite belonging to the Terran military opened its ventral bay doors. It didn't fire lasers. It didn't launch missiles. It simply dropped 3 solid tungsten telephone poles, each weighing 20 tons. Known in ancient military history as Project Thor, or the rods from God, it was a weapon of pure kinetic devastation. Gravity did all the work. Impact in 3, 2, 1. Grayson counted down. Thomas curled into a tight ball behind the stone pillar, bracing his arms over his helmet. The sky above the courtyard didn't just light up, it tore open. A terrifying shrieking howl ripped through the atmosphere, louder than any thunder, as the tungsten rods superheated the air around them into plasma trails. The Vornak mercenaries looking up barely had time to register the streaks of fire descending from the heavens. The impact was apocalyptic. The rod struck the courtyard with the force of a tactical nuclear weapon, but without the radiation. The shockwave visibly rippled through the air, shattering every remaining pane of glass in the citadel's forward wings. The ground heaved violently, throwing mercenaries into the air like discarded toys. The 3 Vornak dropships were instantly vaporized, crushed flat against the bedrock, their reactor cores imploding from the sheer kinetic shock. Dust pulverized stone, and smoke swallowed the world. The sound of ringing deafened all comms. Slowly, agonizingly, Thomas uncurled himself. His armor's diagnostic HUD was flashing red with warnings about concussive damage and compromised seals, but he was alive. The massive stone pillar had absorbed the worst of the lateral shockwave. He stood up his boots, crunching on glass and bone. The smoke began to thin, whipped away by the roaring fires. The courtyard was gone. In its place was a massive glowing crater of glassed stone. Of the hundreds of elite Vornak mercenaries, nothing remained but scattered smoking pieces of armor. Thomas lowered his weapon, his breath ragged. "Package delivered, Grayson," he coughed into the comms. "Vanguard neutralized." "Copy that, Sergeant," Grayson replied, though his voice was trembling. "But we have a bigger problem." Before Grayson could explain, the ambient light in the courtyard suddenly dimmed. Thomas looked up through the dissipating smoke. The sky above Ethelgard was normally a brilliant deep violet. Now it was being blotted out by a shadow so massive it defied comprehension. Descending slowly through the upper atmosphere was the Vornak dreadnought, the Leviathan. It was 3 miles of jagged black metal, bristling with heavy plasma batteries and launch bays. Without the Citadel's planetary defense shield to keep it at bay, the massive warship had entered low orbit, positioning itself directly over the capital city. A deafening synthesized voice boomed from the ship, echoing across the entire valley. "Ethelgard Citadel, this is the Vornak Syndicate. You have destroyed our vanguard. We will now reduce your royal palace to a crater. Surrender the Queen within 5 minutes, or we will initiate an orbital glassing. You cannot stop us." The heavy blast doors behind Thomas hissed open. Queen Isolde stepped out into the ruined courtyard, her silver armor catching the flickering light of the fires. Her golden eyes tracked up to the massive ship hanging in the sky. Her expression was a mix of awe and profound, helpless rage. "They intend to burn the city," Isolde whispered. "Millions will die." Thomas marched up the steps to meet her. He reached up and unlocked his helmet, pulling it off with a hiss of depressurization. His face was covered in soot, and blood tricked from his nose, a casualty of the massive shockwave. "Your Majesty," Thomas said, wiping the blood away with the back of his gauntlet. "We need to get the planetary shield back online, now." "We can't," Isolde replied bitterly. "Alistair used a biometric lock on the mainframe in the war room. It requires his specific telepathic resonance and his genetic signature to undo." "He's in the holding cells," Thomas growled. "Let me go down there. I can be very persuasive." He'll give me the code or I'll bring you his head." "It doesn't work like that, Thomas," Isolde explained, shaking her head. "Kalen technology is biosymbiotic. If Alistair is under extreme duress, in pain, or dead, his neural resonance changes. The system will detect it and permanently brick the shield generator as a security measure. He has to willingly unlock it." Thomas cursed, kicking a piece of rubble. 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes before that floating junk heap turns this city into an ashtray. Do we have any ships that can break orbit and take it on? "The Gilded Crest is fast, but it is a royal transport, not a warship," Isolde said. "Its weapons would merely scratch the paint on a dreadnought's hull." Thomas looked back up at the dreadnought. His mind raced, calculating trajectories, payloads, and terrible, desperate odds. He thought of the twins, Lysander and Aurelia, huddled in the bunker, deep beneath their feet. He thought of his vow to never let another child burn because he didn't do enough. "Raytheon," Thomas muttered. "What did you say?" Isolde asked. "Raytheon." Thomas repeated, his eyes locking on to hers. "An old Earth defense contractor. Back in the early days of the expansion wars, when humanity was outgunned by larger alien vessels, they developed a dirty, suicidal tactic. If you can't punch through their shields from the outside, you bypass them entirely." Isolde's telepathic aura spiked with confusion, but also a glimmer of hope. "Bypass them, how their point defense cannons will shred any ship that gets too close." "Not if the ship is cloaked," Thomas said. "Does the Gilded Crest have a stealth drive?" "Yes," Isolde nodded. "A state-of-the-art light-bending array. It renders the ship invisible to thermal and optical sensors, but it only lasts for a few minutes before the coils overheat." "A few minutes is all I need," Thomas said, his voice hardening into something cold and terrifying. "If I can get the Gilded Crest right up to the hull of the dreadnought, I can manually cut my way in. Boarding a dreadnought alone." Isolde grabbed his arm, her grip shockingly strong. "That is madness, Thomas. There are 1,000 mercenaries on that ship." "I don't need to fight 1,000 mercenaries," Thomas said, pulling a massive, heavy cylindrical device from his lower back armor compartment. It was painted hazard yellow with the bold letters T. Havok stenciled on the side. "I just need to get to their main reactor core and plant this. It's a tactical high-yield antimatter void charge. I borrowed it from the Lockheed Martin Armory during a contract 10 years ago. Been saving it for a rainy day." Isolde stared at the device. She could sense no telepathic energy from it, but the sheer destructive potential of antimatter was universally understood. "If that detonates inside their shields, the feedback loop will tear the ship apart from the inside out," Isolde reasoned. "But how will you get off the ship in time?" Thomas didn't answer. He just looked away toward the landing pads. Isolde realized the truth immediately. Her heart ached. "It is a one-way trip. It's the only play we have, Your Majesty," Thomas said softly. "You need to stay here, command your people, keep Alistair secured. When that ship blows, there's going to be a hell of a light show." He turned to walk toward the hangar, but Isolde stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You are a human," Isolde said, her voice dropping an octave, echoing with royal command. "You came to my world to sweep floors. You have already bled for my children. I will not allow you to die for my empire." "With respect, Queen Isolde," Thomas said, his jaw setting stubbornly. "You can't stop me." "I know," she said, and then seamlessly she drew her glowing silver longsword. Thomas instinctively reached for his railgun, but Isolde didn't point the blade at him. Instead, she brought the hilt to her forehead in a traditional Kalan salute, a gesture reserved only for equals. "Which is why I am coming with you," she stated. Thomas blinked, completely caught off guard. "What? No, absolutely not. You are the sovereign. If you die, if I stay here and my city burns, I am a queen of ashes." Isolde interrupted, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, beautiful ferocity. "This is my world. These are my people. I will not hide in a bunker while a human janitor sacrifices himself to save us. We board that ship together, Thomas Wright. You bring the bomb. I will bring the blade." Thomas stared at her. He saw the absolute unbreakable resolve in her alien eyes. For the first time in 30 years, the grizzled, cynical hell-jumper felt a genuine smile tug at the corner of his scarred lips. "All right, Your Majesty," Thomas said, slamming his helmet back onto his head, the visor polarized to black. "Let's go steal a dreadnought." Pilot Bennett was sweating right through his flight suit. He sat in the cockpit of the Gilded Crest, his hands trembling on the control yokes. Behind him stood the two most terrifying beings on the planet, his sovereign clad in gleaming battle armor, and the human janitor, who was currently strapping a localized antimatter bomb to his chest like it was a canteen. "The light-bending array is a fragile system." "Majesty," Bennett stammered, running the pre-flight diagnostics. "It wasn't designed for a combat drop. If we take even a glancing hit from debris, the cloaking field will shatter, and that dreadnought's point defense cannons will vaporize us in half a second." "Then do not hit any debris, Bennett," Queen Isolde said evenly, drawing her plasma longsword and resting the humming blade over her shoulder. "Take us up." Thomas slapped a fresh magazine of depleted uranium slugs into his railgun. "Just get us into their blind spot, beneath the primary thruster array. The radiation interference from their own engines will blind their localized sensors. We jump the gap cut through the hull and walk right into their basement." Bennett swallowed hard. Jumping the gap, right, of course. The Gilded Crest lifted off the private landing tier, its sleek aerodynamic hull humming with immense power. As it cleared the burning towers of the Citadel, Bennett engaged the stealth drive. To the naked eye, the royal transport simply vanished, replaced by a slight shimmering distortion in the air. Inside the cockpit, the tension was suffocating. Through the viewport, the Vornak dreadnought. The Leviathan loomed like a jagged black moon. It was horrifyingly massive. Its underside was a maze of protruding plasma batteries, launch bays, and thick industrial piping. "They are broadcasting the final countdown," Isolde noted, her golden eyes tracking the massive ship. 3 minutes until they glass the city. "Punch it, Bennett," Thomas ordered. The cloaked transport shot upward, defying gravity, pulling punishing G-forces. They weaved through the smoke and the falling ash of the destroyed Vanguard. "Proximity warning," Bennett whispered, his eyes glued to the instruments. "We are entering their thermal exhaust radius. The hull temperature is spiking. The cloaking coils are overheating." "Hold it together," Thomas muttered, staring at the rapidly approaching metal belly of the dreadnought. 200 meters. 100 meters, Bennett chanted, engaging magnetic docking clamps. With a heavy metallic thud that vibrated through their teeth, the Gilded Crest locked onto the underbelly of the Leviathan, nestled directly between two massive plasma exhaust vents. The radiation here was intense, a chaotic soup of static that perfectly masked their presence. Thomas hit the depressurization switch on the airlock. He didn't have a 0G tether, so he engaged the magnetic boots of his assault armor. "You're up, Your Majesty," Thomas said, his voice metallic through his helmet. "Keep your mind open. We need to know where their patrols are before we see them." Isolde stepped into the airlock beside him. She closed her eyes, extending her telepathic aura out like a radar ping, piercing through the dense durasteel hull of the enemy ship. "I feel them," she whispered, her face tightening with disgust. "Hundreds of mines, brutal, greedy, panicked. But the lower engineering deck immediately above us is lightly staffed. 3 mechanics, no heavy guard." "Perfect," Thomas grunted. The outer airlock door hissed open, exposing them to the thin, freezing upper atmosphere. Thomas pulled a handheld thermal breaching torch from his belt. It was a vicious little tool burning at a temperature that made the sun look cool. He pressed it against the dreadnought's hull. Sparks rained down into the clouds below as the human cut a perfect circular hole through 3 feet of military-grade armor in under 30 seconds. He kicked the cut section inward. It fell with a loud clang onto the deck plates of the engineering sector. Thomas dropped in first, his railgun raised. Isolde landed silently behind him, her movements possessing a fluid feline grace that belied her massive height. They were in a dimly lit cavernous access corridor. Thick bundles of fiber optic cables and glowing coolant pipes lined the walls. Down the hall, 3 Vornak mechanics in heavy hazard suits turned around, startled by the noise of the breach. Before they could even reach for their communication radios, Isolde moved. She didn't run. She surged forward like a silver blur. Her plasma sword ignited with a sharp hiss. In one seamless, beautiful arc, she swept the blade through the first 2 mechanics, severing their weapons and their life support rigs in a single stroke. The 3rd mechanic lunged for an alarm panel. Thomas fired a single, silenced kinetic dart from his wrist launcher. It pinned the alien's hand to the bulkhead an inch away from the alarm button. Isolde finished the job with a brutal pommel strike to the Vornak's helmet, knocking him cold. "Clear," she breathed, deactivating her blade to reduce their thermal footprint. Thomas walked up to the unconscious alien and ripped the security keycard from his belt. "Not bad, Your Majesty. You ever think about joining the Hell Jumpers?" Isolde offered a faint, dangerous smile. "Lead the way, Sergeant." According to the schematics downloaded from the unconscious mechanic, the primary reactor core was 5 decks up, buried deep within the dreadnought's fortified center. They moved through the alien vessel like phantoms. This was the ultimate synergy of human tactical brilliance and Kaelan telepathic dominance. Queen Isolde acted as a living radar system, pushing her consciousness outward to sense the intent of approaching patrols. "Squad of 6 approaching," Isolde whispered, pressing her back against a massive coolant pipe. "They are complacent. Let them pass," Thomas signaled, melting into the shadows. For 20 agonizing minutes, they ascended through the labyrinthine bowels of the Leviathan, leaving a silent trail of bypassed security doors and quietly neutralized stragglers. But as they reached the blast-proof corridor leading to the main reactor room, their luck evaporated. The mines inside, Isolde warned, her golden eyes widening. "Shielded, hardened, I cannot read their intent, only malice." Vornak heavies, Thomas diagnosed, checking his railgun. Cybernetically enhanced shock troops, pain receptors stripped out. "How many?" 10, Isolde said. "And the ship's commander, Garrett. He is coordinating the orbital strike. The countdown is at 90 seconds. "Time's up," Thomas growled, unholstering the heavy cylinder of localized antimatter. He set the T-Havoc timer to 60 seconds. "I blow the doors. You go for the commander. Cut the head off the snake. I'll draw the heavy's fire and plant the package." Thomas pulled a shaped breaching charge, slapped it onto the heavy maglocks of the reactor door, and detonated it. The Durasteel doors blew inward with a deafening roar. They breached simultaneously, stepping into a terrifying monument to alien engineering. The reactor core was a massive spinning pillar of superheated plasma bathing the room in blinding violet light. The Vornak heavies were waiting. They were walking tanks in ablative siege armor wielding rotary plasma cannons. High above on a catwalk stood Commander Garrett behind a localized energy shield. "Tear the primate apart!" Garrett roared. Thomas hit the slick grated floor, sliding behind a command console, just as green plasma melted the air where his head had been. He popped up, unleashing a hypersonic barrage from the M76. The depleted uranium rounds tore through the room. A concentrated burst to their knee joints sent 3 heavies crashing to the floor, cybernetics sparking wildly. Isolde was a force of absolute nature. Anticipating their firing arcs telepathically, she vaulted a railing, dropping directly onto the shoulders of a Vornak heavy. She drove her humming plasma sword straight down through his collarbone, using his dying body as a meat shield against the crossfire. "Covering fire!" Thomas shouted, sprinting toward the central reactor column. A glancing plasma bolt caught him in the ribs, shattering his armor plating. He tasted blood, but adrenaline overrode the agony. He dragged himself to the primary coolant intake. "The intake is bio-locked," Garrett laughed. "You cannot breach the core without a Vornak genetic signature." "I don't need a genetic signature," Thomas spat. "I have a 50 caliber railgun." He jammed the barrel against the Durasteel housing and held the trigger down. The overwhelming kinetic force shattered the biolock, ripping the casing wide open. Thomas slammed the T-Havoc device into the rupture, the magnetic clamps engaging instantly. He hit the arming switch. 45 seconds. "Bomb is set, run," Thomas roared. Isolde decapitated her final target. Garrett was screaming in panic, sprinting toward the emergency blast doors. "The elevators are locked down," Isolde yelled. "Bennett," Thomas barked into his comms. "Route compromised. We need an exit." "There is an external garbage chute 3 corridors down," Pilot Bennett's panicked voice crackled back. "It vents into the void. I am bringing the crest around." "A garbage chute," Isolde yelled. "A Terran classic." Thomas hurled his last fragmentation grenade toward the blast doors. "Go!" They sprinted down the scorched corridor to a heavy hatch marked with hazard symbols. Thomas kicked the release lever. The hatch swung open to a dark tube dropping into nothingness. 20 seconds. "Ladies first!" Thomas yelled, firing blindly down the hallway. Isolde threw herself into the chute. Thomas followed a heartbeat later, the hatch slamming shut above him. They shot out of the bottom of the dreadnought, plummeting into the freezing vacuum. Directly below, the gilded crest hovered with its rear cargo ramp extended. Isolde hit the angled deck, rolling expertly. Thomas slammed down a second later. "Burn the drives!" Thomas screamed, slamming the ramp button. The gilded crest banked violently, its thrusters burning white-hot as it dove toward the planet. High above, the T-Havoc charge detonated. The antimatter fed back into itself. The Leviathan violently imploded its massive hull, buckling inward before shattering outward into a billion pieces of molten slag. Inside the gilded crest, the silence was absolute. Thomas pulled his helmet off his face, bruised and bleeding. He looked at Queen Isolde. Her priceless silver armor was ruined, covered in soot. She looked at the battered human with profound respect. Then the queen threw her head back and let out a booming, triumphant laugh. "By the ancestors, Thomas," she laughed. You humans are completely, utterly insane. Thomas let out a tired chuckle. It's a survival trait, Your Majesty. Keeps the galaxy on its toes. 3 weeks later, the citadel of Ethelgard was already rising from the ashes. The conspirators had been rooted out, and the Vornak Syndicate had formally retreated from the entire sector, terrified of the whispers that the Kaelin Queen possessed a human weapon capable of erasing dreadnoughts from existence. Under the newly restored glass dome of the Grand Promenade, Queen Isolde held a royal commendation ceremony. Standing proudly before the throne was Thomas Wright, no longer wearing a janitor's jumpsuit, but the immaculate midnight blue dress uniform of a Praetorian commander. Beside the throne, young Prince Lysander and Princess Aurelia waved excitedly, and Thomas offered them a warm, subtle wink. As Isolde pinned the star of Ethelgard to his chest, she whispered that his salary had been doubled. Thomas simply smiled and replied, "Much obliged, Your Majesty, but just so we're clear, I'm not doing Windows." What an explosive finale! Thomas Wright proved that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy isn't a plasma cannon or a dreadnought. It's a human with a reason to fight. If you loved this HFY story and want to hear more tales of humanity showing the galaxy what we are truly made of, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment from Thomas's brutal last stand. Thanks for watching, and as always, humanity, fuck yeah.